My name is Bernice Clark. I am 32 years old. 2 weeks after my wedding fell apart, my mother invited me to a family dinner at our home in Edina, Minnesota. She called it a night for family healing. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I could force myself to walk through the front door. The house was packed with relatives holding stiff drinks. As soon as I stepped into the foyer, the entire room went dead silent. The kind of heavy, suffocating silence that means everyone knows a secret you do not. Then I heard the sound of heels on the hardwood stairs. My younger sister Vanessa walked down the steps. She was wearing my custom ivory wedding dress. The dress I had paid for myself. The dress that still had my name stitched in fine thread right over the heart. It fit her perfectly. My brain snagged on that detail while the rest of my world collapsed. It fit her like it was made for her. My ex-fiancé, Derek Lawson, stepped forward to meet her at the bottom of the stairs. He was a wealthy portfolio manager who always smelled of expensive cologne and effortless arrogance. He took Vanessa by the hand, smiled at the crowd of our relatives, and announced their engagement. My mother Helen stepped into the center of the room and raised her crystal wine glass. Her eyes were shining with absolute pride. She looked at the two people who had just shattered my life and told the room that this was simply fate. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at my father Richard, silently begging him to step in to defend his eldest daughter. He did not raise his glass, but he did lean close to me. I could smell the sharp, bitter sting of scotch on his breath. He whispered to me, "Do not make a scene, Bernice. Just move on." So I did not make a scene. I set my glass down on the nearest table, turned around, and walked right back out into the freezing Minnesota night. They mistook my silence for weakness. They thought I was just the discarded sister walking away with nothing. They had absolutely no idea that a year later, my sister would walk into my own wedding alone, hoping to pity me. And the second she saw the groom standing at the end of my aisle, the entire room would go quiet for a reason she was entirely unprepared for. If you have ever been told to just move on, while your own family celebrated your humiliation, drop a comment below. Tell me your age and where you are listening from today. I read every single one. Welcome to Grape Vengeance. Like and subscribe if you want to know exactly who my sister saw waiting at my altar. Let me take you back to the night of that terrible toast, because you need to understand exactly how it felt to stand in the doorway of my childhood home and realize I was entirely alone. The driveway was packed with luxury cars. My mother had hired a valet for what she claimed was an intimate family gathering. That should have been my first warning. I stood on the porch, feeling the brutal bite of the winter wind through my thin wool coat, listening to the muffled laughter leaking through the heavy oak door. I had spent my entire life being the reliable daughter. The one who fixed the problems, the one who never asked for too much. When I found out Derek was sleeping with Vanessa just 7 days before I was supposed to marry him, I was the one who made the humiliating phone calls to cancel the caterer and the venue. I packed my own boxes. I endured my mother telling me that families need to forgive and forget. But standing in that foyer, watching Vanessa smooth her hands over the ivory silk I had chosen, I realized there was nothing to forgive, because there was no mistake. My sister had not fallen into bed with my fiancé in a momentary lapse of judgment. She was parading around in a dress that had to be altered, hemmed, and fitted long before my wedding was ever officially canceled. I walked to my car with my father's cruel advice ringing in my ears. Move on. He wanted me to disappear quietly so they could enjoy Derek's money without the guilt of my presence. I gripped my steering wheel until my knuckles turned white under the streetlights. I decided right then that I would move on. But I was going to do it by finding out exactly how deep the lies in my family truly went. I did not block my family's phone numbers. Blocking them would have been a reaction. And a reaction was exactly what my mother wanted. Helen thrived on drama. If I blocked her, she could play the victim to her country club friends, weeping about her estranged, bitter daughter. So I did something that drove her entirely out of her mind. I simply stopped answering. I let the phone ring. I watched the text messages pile up on my screen like discarded trash. My mother sent messages disguised as concern. She wrote things like, "We are all so worried about your mental state, Bernice. Please do not isolate yourself from the people who love you." My sister sent nothing. Vanessa was too busy playing the blushing bride to bother with the sister whose life she had stolen. And my father, true to form, sent a single text 3 days after that humiliating dinner. He wrote, "I hope you are being reasonable about the shared lease on the apartment." That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of the betrayal, just a clinical concern about a rental contract. Every time my screen lit up with their names, my chest tightened, but I never typed a single word back. I let their false narratives echo into a void. Instead of crying, I poured every ounce of my agonizing grief into my career. I work as a high-end estate appraiser and liquidator in the wealthiest zip codes of Minnesota. My job is not glamorous. I step in when rich families fall apart. When a patriarch dies in massive debt or a bitter divorce fractures a fortune, I am the one hired to walk through the sprawling mansions in Wayzata and Edina to put a price tag on the wreckage. I am professionally trained to look at beautiful, expensive properties and find the hidden rot underneath. I know exactly how to check for water damage behind imported silk wallpaper. I know how to spot a fake painting hanging above a marble fireplace. I spent my days dismantling the glittering illusions of other wealthy families, cataloging their secrets and selling off their assets. I became incredibly proficient at identifying a fraud. It kept me sane. It gave me a sense of absolute control when my personal life felt like a collapsed building. My business partner Sarah was the only person who actually saw me during that first month. Sarah is a woman who does not tolerate nonsense from anyone. We built our appraisal firm from the ground up, fighting for every single client. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, we were standing in the cavernous living room of a foreclosed estate, logging inventory. My phone buzzed in my pocket for the 5th time that hour. My mother was calling again. My hands were actually shaking as I pulled the phone out. I stared at the glowing screen, a familiar, sickening guilt creeping up my throat. I had been conditioned my entire life to answer when Helen summoned me. Sarah stopped writing on her clipboard. She walked across the dusty hardwood floor, took the phone directly out of my hand and silenced it. She looked me right in the eyes and said, "You do not owe them a seat at your table, Bernice. Not the big table and not the little one. You owe them absolutely nothing." She handed the phone back. It was the first time in my 32 years that someone gave me permission to walk away from my own blood. I took her advice. I put the phone away and I kept working. But a month later, the past reached out and grabbed me anyway. I had to drive back to the old apartment I used to share with Derek. I was just stopping by to collect the final batch of forwarded mail from the old landlord. It was a cold, miserable Minnesota morning. The sky was a flat, heavy gray. I stood in the small lobby of the building, flipping through the stack of envelopes. Most of it was junk mail, a few utility bills. But then my thumbs stopped on the thick white envelope bearing the logo of a major national bank. It was addressed to both me and Derek Lawson. It was a statement for a joint checking account we had opened 2 years ago to save for the wedding catering costs. Derek had told me face-to-face the morning I moved out that he had formally closed this account and transferred the remaining balance to my personal bank. He had looked me right in the eye and said it was fully taken care of. Derek was a man who handled millions of dollars a day for his wealthy clients. He did not make careless financial mistakes. Or so I thought. His absolute, blinding arrogance had made him incredibly sloppy. He had not closed the account, He had simply drained it and left it open, assuming I would never check the physical mail at the old apartment again. I tore the envelope open right there in the quiet lobby. My hands were freezing, but my blood suddenly felt like it was boiling. I unfolded the crisp paper and scanned the itemized list of transactions. For the first 2 pages, it was completely mundane. Grocery runs, a few gas station stops, coffee shops near Derek's financial firm. But on the 3rd page, near the bottom of the column, a single line of black ink jumped off the paper and hit me like a physical blow. It was a charge for $850. The merchant was listed as a luxury bridal boutique located in downtown St. Paul. I knew this boutique. I had actually recommended it to wealthy clients. It was an exclusive shop that required a hefty deposit just to book a private tailoring appointment. I dragged my trembling finger across the paper to look at the date of the transaction. I read the date 3 times. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the cold lobby air, and opened them again. The numbers had not changed. The charge was processed exactly 3 months before I caught Derek sleeping with my sister. 90 days before my wedding blew up. I stood perfectly still in the empty lobby. The silence of the building seemed to press heavily against my ears. Vanessa had sworn to everyone that the affair was a sudden, uncontrollable accident. She had cried in our parents' living room, claiming they had simply spent too much time together, planning a surprise birthday party for me, and one thing just naturally led to another. My mother had eagerly swallowed that exact story. Helen had stood in the foyer a month ago, raising her crystal glass and loudly calling it a spontaneous act of destiny. She told 40 people that fate had just stepped in and rearranged the pieces of our family for the better. But spontaneous, passionate affairs do not come with an $850 bridal boutique deposit 90 days in advance. You do not accidentally schedule a luxury tailoring appointment while caught up in a sudden whirlwind romance. You do it when you have a deliberate plan. The betrayal was not a tragic, unexpected accident. It was a calculated, meticulously executed schedule. Derek and Vanessa had not just fallen into bed together in the final desperate week before my wedding. They had been actively building a brand new life right behind my back for an entire season. The narrative my family was proudly selling to their wealthy friends had a massive, gaping hole in it. The beautiful dress my sister wore coming down those stairs was not a last-minute grab from my closet. It had been professionally altered ahead of time. I realized that my own sister had been actively fitting herself into my exact life while I was still trying to live it. The sheer sociopathic nature of the lie made my stomach physically churn. But it also ignited something cold and hard inside my chest. The paralyzing grief that had been suffocating me for an entire month instantly vanished. It was entirely replaced by a sharp, clinical focus. I was a professional estate liquidator. I knew exactly how to dig through the garbage to find the undeniable truth. I folded the bank statement, carefully slid it into my leather bag, and walked out of the building. I knew exactly where I was driving next. I was going to downtown St. Paul. I was going to pull the rotten foundation right out from under their perfect fate. I parked my car on a quiet cobblestone street in downtown St. Paul. The luxury bridal boutique sat right on the corner, displaying a massive silk gown in the frosted front window. The air outside was freezing, but I did not feel the cold at all. My entire body was running on pure adrenaline and cold calculation. I had sent dozens of wealthy clients to this exact shop over the past 5 years. Whenever I liquidated an estate and a wealthy heiress needed a recommendation for a custom wedding dress, I always gave them this address. The owner of the shop owed a significant portion of her annual revenue to my referrals. She knew my face, she knew my name, and most importantly, she knew exactly who had purchased the ivory silk dress that my sister wore coming down those stairs. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The brass bell chimed softly above my head. The boutique smelled of expensive lavender and hot steam from the fabric presses. It was a hushed, elegant space designed to make brides feel like absolute royalty. Margot, the owner, was standing near the front counter, arranging a display of pearl veils. She was a woman in her late 50s who prided herself on extreme discretion and flawless customer service. When the bell chimed, she turned around with a bright, professional smile. That smile vanished the absolute second she saw my face. Margot actually took a physical step backward. Her hand dropped the delicate tulle veil she was holding. It fluttered quietly to the pristine hardwood floor. She did not say hello. She did not offer her condolences about my canceled wedding. Her eyes darted nervously toward the back room where her seamstresses were working. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know before I even asked the question. She was terrified. I walked straight up to the glass counter. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone perfectly level and completely stripped of any emotion. I spoke to her with the exact same authority I use when I am auditing a fraudulent estate inventory. I need to see your alteration ledger, Margot. I want to see the specific entry for my ivory silk gown. Margot swallowed hard. Her hands began to tremble as she rested them on the glass counter. She tried to construct a professional defense. She stammered about client confidentiality and store policies. She told me she could not legally disclose the details of another woman fitting appointment. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on the glass, directly over her trembling fingers. I looked her right in the eyes. I reminded her that I was the one who paid the initial deposit for that dress. I reminded her that the gown legally belonged to me. Then I casually mentioned the 3 wealthy clients I had sent her way just last season. I told her that if she did not show me the book right this second, I would ensure that every single high society bride in the greater Minneapolis area knew this boutique was actively participating in domestic theft. The color completely drained from her face. She knew I was not making an empty threat. I had the professional connections to destroy her business in a single afternoon. Margot did not argue anymore. She reached under the counter and pulled out a thick, heavy, leather-bound ledger. The spine cracked as she opened it. She flipped through the thick paper pages, her manicured fingers shaking violently. She found the right page and slowly turned the heavy book around so it faced me. There it was, written in crisp black ink. The name at the top of the alteration ticket was Vanessa Clark, my younger sister. I dragged my finger down the page, absorbing every single damning detail. The initial fitting date was recorded clearly on the right side of the paper. I did the math in my head instantly. The date was exactly 14 weeks before my wedding was officially canceled. 14 weeks. That is 3.5 months. My sister had walked into this boutique 3.5 months before I caught her in bed with Derek. She had brought my exact dress with her. I stared at the specific measurements written next to her name. The seamstress had meticulously recorded the instructions to take the waist in by 2 inches and raise the hemline by 3 inches. It was a total structural overhaul of the garment. At the very bottom of the page, written in red ink, was a specific handwritten note from Margot. The note said, "Client requested absolute secrecy. Do not call the primary phone number on file." The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me so hard, my knees actually felt weak. I gripped the edge of the glass counter to keep myself entirely upright. Vanessa did not just happen to sleep with my fiancé in a moment of weakness. She had not stumbled into a tragic accidental romance. She had been methodically plotting to take over my entire life for months. But a massive logistical question immediately surfaced in my mind. How did she get the dress to the boutique in the first place? The gown had been hanging in the back of my locked closet in the apartment I shared with Derek. I kept it in a heavy, opaque garment bag. I checked on it occasionally, just to admire the fabric. Then, I remembered the spare key. I kept a spare key hidden inside a ceramic planter on our apartment balcony, just in case of emergencies. Derek knew exactly where that key was hidden. He had to have given Vanessa the key. My own sister had waited until I was at work appraising properties. She had unlocked my front door, walked into my bedroom, opened my closet, and stolen my wedding dress. She brought it to downtown St. Paul, had it pinned and measured, and then she drove it right back to my apartment and hung it up before I ever got home from the office. The absolute sociopathic arrogance required to execute that plan was staggering. She was fitting herself into my life while I was still paying the bills. I looked up from the ledger. Margot was watching me, her face completely ashen. She looked like she was waiting for me to start screaming or throwing merchandise. But I did not scream. I felt a strange, freezing calm wash over my entire nervous system. I realized something fundamentally terrifying about the situation. You do not steal a bride's dress and pay for expensive, permanent alterations unless you are absolutely certain that the original bride will never walk down the aisle. You do not chop 3 inches off a silk hemline if there is even a tiny chance that the original owner might try to wear it. Vanessa and Derek knew for an absolute fact that my wedding was never going to happen. They had guaranteed it. They had planned the collapse of my relationship 14 weeks in advance. But why did they wait? Why did they let me spend the next 3 months paying the florist, paying the caterer, and sending out expensive engraved invitations? If Derek wanted to leave me for my sister, why did he not just break off the engagement in March? Why did he string me along until the final week of the wedding? And more importantly, why did my parents act so perfectly rehearsed when the explosion finally happened? My mother had not cried when I canceled the wedding. She had immediately pivoted to calling it fate. She had organized an elegant celebration dinner in a matter of days. You do not plan a flawless catered dinner party while dealing with a sudden family crisis. My family had planned this. All of them. They had orchestrated the destruction of my future. But a conspiracy this large requires a massive motive. My sister is selfish and my mother is vain, but they are not criminal masterminds. They do not operate without a highly lucrative reason. There was a missing piece to this puzzle, a massive, gaping hole in the center of their perfect narrative. I needed to know exactly why they traded me for Vanessa. I closed the heavy leather ledger with a loud, definitive snap. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet boutique. Margot jumped slightly. I did not say a single word to her. I turned my back on the terrified woman and walked out of the shop. I got back into my car and locked the doors. I sat in the driver's seat, listening to the quiet hum of the engine. I was no longer a heartbroken woman trying to heal. I was a professional auditor, hunting down a massive fraud. If Derek and my family had been planning this for months, then Derek had left a paper trail. Men who operate with that level of extreme arrogance always leave a trail. I needed an insider. I needed someone who understood exactly how Derek managed his life and his money. I closed my eyes and searched my memory for any detail, any conversation I might have overlooked during the chaos of the past year. Then a name flashed into my mind. Julian Sterling. 6 months before my wedding completely fell apart, Julian had asked me to meet him for coffee. He was a senior compliance officer at the wealth management firm where Derek worked. He was a quiet, observant man who always stood at the edges of corporate parties. During that coffee, Julian had looked me in the eye and warned me that Derek was hiding massive secrets. He told me the numbers did not make sense. I had been so deeply conditioned by my toxic family to avoid conflict that I immediately chose the comfortable lie. I told Derek about the meeting. Derek had smoothly convinced me that Julian was just a jealous, bitter coworker trying to ruin our happiness. My parents had enthusiastically agreed. A week later, Julian was suddenly and quietly fired from the firm. Sitting in my freezing car, holding the steering wheel, I realized that Julian Sterling was the only person in the entire world who had actually tried to protect me. And I had essentially helped Derek destroy his career. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I opened my browser and searched for Julian name. I needed to find out where he was working now. The conflict had completely shifted. It was no longer about a stolen wedding dress or a cheating fiancé. It was about uncovering a buried secret that was powerful enough to make my own parents sell me out. I was going to find Julian, and I was going to follow the money. I sat in the freezing interior of my car, parked on the cobblestone street outside the bridal boutique. My breath plumed in the cold air, but I was entirely focused on the glowing screen of my phone. The crushing realization that my family had orchestrated my downfall was settling into my bones, but it was rapidly being replaced by a fierce, burning need for answers. I opened my internet browser and began searching for a name I had actively tried to forget. Julian Sterling. 6 months before my wedding was supposed to happen, Julian had reached out to me. He was a senior compliance officer at the prestigious wealth management firm where Derek worked. Julian was the man whose entire job was to monitor the financial advisors to ensure they followed federal regulations. He was the quiet guy, the man who stood at the back of the corporate holiday parties sipping club soda while Derek held court in the center of the room, loudly buying rounds of expensive scotch for the managing partners. Derek was the golden boy rainmaker. Julian was the invisible watchdog. I remembered the afternoon Julian asked me to meet him at a small diner far away from the financial district. He looked nervous. He kept turning his coffee mug in slow circles. Julian did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with genuine, deep concern. He told me he was risking his entire career by speaking to me. Then he looked me right in the eyes and warned me that Derek was hiding things. He said the numbers in Derek's client ledgers did not make sense. He warned me that walking into a legal marriage with a man who was burying financial secrets was incredibly dangerous. I should have listened. I appraise fraudulent estates for a living. I know exactly what hidden rot looks like. But at the time, I did exactly what my toxic family had trained me to do since childhood. I protected the comfortable lie. My mother, Helen, had spent 30 years teaching me that causing a scene was the ultimate sin. She raised me to believe that a smooth, glittering surface was always more important than an ugly truth. So I left that diner, and I went straight home to Derek. I told my fiancé everything Julian had said. Derek did not panic. He did not get angry. He executed a flawless performance of wounded betrayal. He sighed deeply, pulled me into his arms, and smoothly explained that Julian was just a jealous, bitter coworker. Derek claimed Julian was severely underperforming at the firm and was trying to sabotage the top earners out of pure spite. I wanted to believe Derek. It was easier to believe the man I was going to marry than to face the terrifying possibility that my life was built on a scam. That weekend, I went to my parents' house for Sunday dinner, and I told them about the strange encounter. My father, Richard, poured himself a drink and laughed. He called Julian a pathetic loser who wanted to ruin things for successful people. My mother patted my hand and told me to block Julian number immediately. She said strong women do not let paranoid strangers ruin their perfect engagements. We all closed ranks around the lie, because the lie kept everyone comfortable. Exactly 1 week later, Julian Sterling was fired. Derek had used his massive leverage at the firm to march into the human resources department and demand Julian be terminated for inappropriate harassment. Derek painted himself as the victim, and because he brought in millions of dollars in management fees, the firm protected their golden boy. They tossed Julian out on the street. I had watched a good, honest man lose his livelihood because he tried to save me. And I had done absolutely nothing to stop it. Sitting in my car with the bridal shop alteration receipt burning a hole in my leather bag, the crushing weight of my own complicity hit me. I had participated in my own destruction. Julian was the only person in my entire life who had actually tried to rescue me from a burning building, and I had handed the arsonist the matches to burn Julian too. I typed his name into a corporate registry database. Finding him was not easy. When a major financial firm pushes a compliance officer out, they usually try to ruin his reputation on the way down. But Julian was resilient. I scrolled through several pages of search results until I found a modest independent business listing. Julian had opened his own private compliance auditing firm. He had his own office in a quiet suburb. I clicked on the contact page and found a direct cell phone number listed for emergency client consultations. My thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs. I was about to reach out to a man whose career I had helped destroy. I had no right to ask him for anything. I had no right to expect forgiveness. But I also knew he was the only key to unlocking the massive, gaping hole in my family narrative. I took a deep, ragged breath and typed out a single text message. I kept it brief because I did not deserve to make excuses. You were right. I am sorry I did not listen. I hit send. The digital swoosh sounded incredibly loud in the quiet car. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat like it was on fire. I stared out the windshield at the frost gathering on the glass. I prepared myself for the silence. I fully expected him to ignore me. Or worse, I expected him to reply with a scathing message telling me never to contact him again. I sat there watching the digital clock on my dashboard tick forward. 1 minute passed, then 2. Exactly 3 minutes after I sent the message, my screen lit up. I snatched the device off the seat. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it into the floorboard. I opened the message thread. Julian did not gloat. He did not ask for a lengthy, groveling apology. He responded with the exact same steady, grounded energy he had shown me in that diner a year ago. His message read, "I am sorry I was right. Let me buy you coffee. There is more you need to know." I stared at those last 7 words until they blurred. There is more you need to know. The air in the car suddenly felt incredibly thin. The conflict had just violently shifted gears. When I walked into the bridal boutique this morning, I was just a betrayed woman looking for proof of a scheduled affair. I was trying to figure out how long my sister had been sleeping with my fiancé. But Julian Sterling did not care about who was sleeping with who. He was a forensic financial auditor. He tracked stolen capital. He followed money laundering schemes. He investigated offshore accounts and leveraged assets. If Julian was telling me there was more I needed to know, it meant this betrayal had absolutely nothing to do with romance. My sister did not steal Derek because of some uncontrollable, passionate spark. And my parents did not protect the new couple simply because they favored Vanessa over me. My family had planned the collapse of my wedding 14 weeks in advance because of money. I put the vehicle in drive and pulled away from the curb. The tires crunched loudly against the frozen pavement. I drove away from the boutique and headed straight toward the address Julian had sent me. I was no longer crying over a broken heart. I was marching directly into a buried financial secret. I knew my family was greedy. My father worshipped his investment portfolio, and my mother worshipped her country club status. But I was about to find out exactly how much cash it took for a mother and a father to look their eldest daughter in the eye and sell her entire future to the highest bidder. I pulled my car into the parking lot of a small diner on the outskirts of the city. The diner was completely unremarkable. It was the kind of place that served cheap coffee and had cracked vinyl booths. It was far away from the polished glass buildings of the financial district and a million miles from the country clubs my parents frequented. I walked through the glass door, and the bell chimed above my head. The air smelled of fried food and stale coffee. I scanned the room and saw Julian sitting in the very back booth. He was wearing a simple dark sweater instead of his usual tailored corporate suits. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp and entirely focused. He did not smile when I slid into the booth across from him. He did not offer any empty pleasantries. He just pushed a mug of black coffee across the scratched table toward me. I looked at him and felt a sudden wave of shame. I wanted to apologize again for getting him fired. I wanted to explain how my family had brainwashed me into avoiding the truth. But before I could speak, Julian raised his hand slightly. He told me to stop. He said I did not owe him an apology because he had not been entirely honest with me during our first meeting. He told me he had held back the worst parts of the truth because he thought it would break me. Now he realized the truth was the only thing that could save me. Julian reached down onto the seat beside him and lifted a heavy manila folder. He placed it squarely in the center of the table. The folder was thick stuffed with printed spreadsheets and financial ledgers. He rested his hands on top of it and looked me directly in the eyes. Julian explained that I had been carrying a massive burden of guilt for a year, believing that Derek got him fired simply because Julian tried to warn me about a cheating scandal. Julian shook his head. He told me that corporate wealth management firms do not fire senior compliance officers over personal relationship gossip. They fire compliance officers when those officers uncover massive, illegal financial operations and threaten to expose the firm. Julian opened the folder and flipped the cover back. The pages were covered in endless rows of numbers, highlighted in yellow and red ink. He pointed to the top sheet. He explained that, a month before he ever warned me about Derek, he had been running a standard internal audit on several high-performing brokers. Derek was the golden boy of the firm, bringing in millions of dollars in management fees. But when Julian dug deep into the back end of Derek client accounts, the math completely collapsed. Derek was not a brilliant financial mind. He was running a sophisticated shell game. He was illegally moving money between client accounts to cover up massive investment losses. He was creating phantom returns on paper, while the actual capital was bleeding out. Julian flipped to the second page of the ledger. He tapped his finger against a specific client name printed in bold black ink. My stomach plummeted to the floor. The name on the account was Richard Clark. It was my father. My father was a man who worshipped his bank accounts. Richard judged every single person he met by their tax bracket and their investment portfolio. He viewed his daughters not as children to be loved, but as assets to be managed. When I brought Derek home for the first time, my father practically crowned him king. Derek was wealthy, he was connected, and he spoke the language of high finance. Richard trusted Derek implicitly. Julian looked at me with deep sympathy. He explained that Derek controlled my father's entire commercial real estate portfolio. The total value on paper was $2.8 million. It was the absolute bulk of my parents' life savings and their entire retirement plan. But Julian pointed to the red columns on the page. He told me the portfolio was entirely unstable. It was heavily leveraged, meaning Derek had borrowed massive amounts of money against my father's real estate assets to fund other failing investments. My father was sitting on a financial time bomb. His entire fortune was a house of cards, and Derek was the only person keeping that house from collapsing. Julian leaned across the table and laid out the terrifying reality of the situation. He told me to think about the timeline. 14 weeks before my wedding, Derek realized he wanted to back out of the relationship. He was tired of me. He wanted a different life. But Derek was trapped by his own massive fraud. If he simply broke off the engagement and walked away from me, my father would be furious. Richard would instantly demand that his $2.8 million portfolio be transferred to a different broker at a different firm as punishment. If my father moved his money, the new broker would conduct a transition audit. The new firm would immediately see the massive holes in the ledger. They would see the illegal leveraging. Derek would be exposed in a matter of days. He would lose his license, he would be sued into bankruptcy, and he would face federal prison time for financial crimes. Derek could not afford to lose my father as a client. He absolutely needed the Clark family trust to stay exactly where it was. He needed to remain a member of the family to keep my parents blind and compliant. So Derek formulated a completely different exit strategy. If he could not marry the older daughter without being miserable, he would just marry the younger one. Vanessa was the perfect target. My sister was incredibly shallow, completely vain, and easily manipulated by shiny objects and expensive dinners. Derek knew Vanessa was intensely jealous of my engagement. He began showering her with attention, buying her expensive gifts and feeding her ego. He groomed her to steal me away. Vanessa thought she was winning a grand romantic prize. She had no idea she was just a desperate financial insurance policy to keep a criminal out of federal prison. I sat in the diner booth, staring at the numbers on the page. The sheer gravity of the conspiracy was crushing the breath right out of my lungs. I looked at Julian and asked the only question that mattered. I asked him if my parents knew. Julian's expression turned incredibly grim. He flipped to the final page in the folder. It was a printed log of internal phone records from the firm. Julian pointed to a cluster of phone calls between my father's cell phone and Derek's private office line. The calls were completely frantic. They were all placed exactly 14 weeks before my wedding was canceled. The exact same week Vanessa took my dress to the bridal boutique in downtown St. Paul. Julian told me that Derek had to secure my father's approval before he made the switch. Derek likely went to my father and confessed that the portfolio was in severe trouble. He probably spun a brilliant lie, claiming the market had turned and they needed to aggressively manage the assets to prevent total ruin. But Derek would have added a clear condition. He would only guarantee the safety of the money if he remained firmly inside the family circle. He told my father he was leaving me for Vanessa. My parents were faced with a brutal choice. They could defend their eldest daughter, throw Derek out of their house, and risk an immediate, catastrophic financial collapse that would wipe out their retirement. Or they could sacrifice my happiness, hand over their younger daughter, and keep their millions of dollars safely hidden in the dark. They chose the money. They did not hesitate. They did not mourn my broken heart. They actively facilitated the betrayal. Suddenly, the night of that terrible dinner party played back in my mind with horrifying clarity. When my mother raised her crystal glass and toasted to fate, she was not talking about romance. She was talking about financial leverage. She was celebrating the fact that their $2.8 million trust was finally secure. When my father leaned in and told me to move on, he was commanding me to walk away quietly so I would not accidentally disrupt the fragile criminal enterprise keeping his bank accounts afloat. My own parents had looked at my life, measured its value against their retirement fund, and sold me to the highest bidder. I did not cry. The tears I had shed over the past month felt completely useless now. Sadness is a luxury for people who have been hurt by accident. I had not been hurt by accident. I had been systematically executed by a family treating me like a bad investment. A new emotion rose up from the bottom of my stomach. It was pure, unadulterated, cold rage. It felt clean. It felt powerful. I looked up from the folder and met Julian's eyes. I asked him what we needed to do next to tear their entire fake empire down. Julian closed the folder and rested his hands on top of it. He told me that internal audits and boutique receipts were a good start, but they were circumstantial. If we brought this to the authorities, Derek would just hire brilliant lawyers to stall the investigation. My father would claim ignorance. They would find a way to wriggle out of the trap. Julian said we needed a smoking gun. We needed absolute, undeniable, documented proof that my parents were actively involved in trading me for the money. We needed a confession. I sat back against the cracked vinyl booth. Getting a confession out of my mother or my father was impossible. They were professional liars who spent their entire lives curating a flawless public image. They would never admit to selling out their own child. But I knew someone who was incredibly arrogant, completely oblivious to consequences, and absolutely desperate to constantly prove she was the favorite child. My sister Vanessa. I realized that Vanessa's ego was a massive liability for them. She loved to brag. She loved to rub her victories in my face. If I waited patiently and gave her just enough silence to make her feel insecure, she would eventually make a catastrophic mistake. She would try to hurt me one more time, and in doing so, she would accidentally hand me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them all. I knew exactly how to break my sister. You do not break a narcissist by screaming at them. You break a narcissist by making them entirely invisible. For 3 straight weeks, I went completely silent. I did not block Vanessa. I needed her communication channels open so she could eventually hang herself with her own words. I went back to my estate appraisal firm. I focused on cataloging antique furniture and valuing commercial properties. I worked late into the night. Julian and I met twice a week at that same quiet diner. We were quietly building a massive financial profile on Derek. Julian was pulling public records and tracking the shell companies Derek used to hide my father failing real estate investments. We were assembling a massive puzzle, but we still needed the final piece. We needed the confession. My mother, Helen, had raised Vanessa to believe she was the center of the universe. Vanessa required constant validation, the way normal people require oxygen. Because I was refusing to react to her stolen engagement, Vanessa was beginning to suffocate. She needed me to cry. She wanted me to scream and beg for an apology so she could feel powerful. When I did not give her that ultimate satisfaction, she started getting sloppy. It started with small, pathetic attempts to bait me. Vanessa would send me pictures of the floral arrangements she was picking out for her new wedding. She sent me a picture of a massive diamond ring sitting on her finger resting against the steering wheel of a brand new luxury SUV Derek had bought to keep her quiet. I looked at the pictures and felt absolutely nothing. I deleted them and went back to work. My silence drove her completely insane. I knew it was only a matter of time before she reached for the biggest weapon she had. She wanted to prove to me that I was completely unloved. She wanted to prove that our parents actively preferred her over me. It happened on a rainy Thursday night. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing a property deed for a client. My phone buzzed loudly against the granite counter. It was a message from Vanessa. The preview on the screen showed a picture attachment. I opened the message. There was no greeting. There was just a caption that read, "Read this and weep, Bernice. Mom always knew Derek and I were meant to be. She supported our true love from the very beginning. You were always just a temporary placeholder." I tapped the image to make it larger. It was a screenshot of a private text message thread. The thread was between Vanessa and our mother, Helen. I immediately looked at the date stamped at the top of the screenshot. It was dated exactly 3 weeks before my wedding blew up. It was the exact same week my father was making those frantic phone calls to Derek's private office line. I read the messages. Vanessa had typed out a long, whining paragraph complaining that Derek was hesitating. She wrote that Derek was worried about the social fallout of breaking off the engagement with me so close to the wedding date. She told our mother that Derek was getting cold feet about the swap. My mother's response was not a sweet maternal blessing of true love. It was a cold, brutal command from a woman who was actively managing a massive financial crisis. Helen replied with 3 terrifying sentences. "He controls the family trust. Do not let him get away. We will handle Bernice." I sat in my kitchen and stared at those words for 10 solid minutes. I read them over and over again until the letters burned themselves into my retinas. He controls the family trust. Vanessa was entirely blinded by her own massive arrogance. She thought this screenshot was a beautiful validation of her romance. She genuinely believed it proved that our mother thought she was a better match for Derek. Vanessa was too stupid to realize what she had just sent me. She had just handed me a signed, written confession. My mother had literally documented the exact motive for destroying my life. She explicitly stated that Derek held the keys to the family money. She ordered her youngest daughter to secure the asset, and she coldly promised to neutralize me as a threat. "We will handle Bernice." That was exactly how my mother viewed my heartbreak. I was just a logistical problem they needed to manage so the money would stay safe. My hands were perfectly steady as I saved the screenshot to a secure digital folder on my phone. I walked into my home office and turned on my wireless printer. I listened to the machine hum as it spit out a high-resolution copy of the conversation. I took the warm paper and walked over to a large corkboard hanging on the wall above my desk. This corkboard used to hold pictures of my friends and beautiful vacation memories. I had taken all of those down a month ago. Now the board was completely bare except for the evidence. I took a red pushpin and pinned the screenshot right in the center of the board. I stepped back and looked at the wall. On the left side, I had pinned a copy of the alteration receipt from the bridal boutique in downtown St. Paul, proving Vanessa stole my dress months in advance. On the right side, I had pinned Julian highlighted financial ledgers, proving Derek was illegally leveraging my father's $2.8 million commercial real estate portfolio. And right in the middle, connecting the two pieces of evidence, was my mother's text message. The picture was absolutely complete. The massive gaping hole in the narrative was entirely filled. I stood in my quiet home office and felt a profound transformation happen inside my own mind. I was no longer a grieving ex-fiancé trying to understand why her family did not love her. That weak, desperate woman was completely gone. I was a professional investigator standing in a war room. I was a prosecutor who had just finished building a bulletproof federal case against her own blood. I picked up my phone and called Julian. He answered on the first ring. I told him I had the smoking gun. I told him my sister had just sent me the exact financial motive wrapped in a petty insult. Julian breathed a heavy sigh of relief through the speaker. He asked me if I wanted to call a lawyer in the morning. He told me we had enough concrete evidence to file a massive civil lawsuit for financial damages and emotional distress. He said we could drag them into a courtroom and force them to answer for what they did. I looked at the corkboard and smiled. It was a cold, empty smile. I told Julian no. I realized that suing them right now would actually be a mercy. If I dragged them into court today, they would just hire expensive defense attorneys and spin the narrative. My mother would cry in front of a judge, claiming her texts were misunderstood. Derek would hide his assets in offshore accounts before discovery began. My father would declare bankruptcy and restructure his debt to protect his country club status. They would survive it. I did not want them to survive it. I wanted them to completely destroy themselves. Derek was building a massive fraudulent empire using my father's stolen money. My mother was parading around the country club soaking up the glory of her wealthy new son-in-law. Vanessa was planning an extravagant wedding funded entirely by illegal capital. They were climbing higher and higher up a very dangerous ladder. I decided I was going to let them keep climbing. I was going to let them build their beautiful fake lives all the way to the sky. Because the higher they climbed, the more spectacular the fall would be when the foundation finally cracked. I told Julian we were going to wait. We were going to sit in the shadows and watch them dig their own graves. We would continue to gather evidence. We would monitor the offshore accounts. We would let them feel completely untouchable. Over the next few months, Julian and I spent hours together, carefully analyzing every single move Derek made. We tracked his fraudulent wire transfers. We mapped out his entire shell game. The work was intense and exhausting, but it created a powerful, undeniable bond between us. Julian was brilliant, calm, and entirely unaffected by the toxic drama that defined my past. He was the exact opposite of the arrogant men my family admired. He did not care about flashy appearances or country club status. He cared about facts, logic, and absolute loyalty. We started out as allies, fighting a common enemy. But as the long, freezing Minnesota winter melted into spring, something profound began to shift between us. The deep trust we built in that quiet diner slowly evolved into a fierce, undeniable respect. I had sworn off marriage entirely after my disaster with Derek. I thought I would never trust another man again. But Julian was quietly and steadily proving that real safety did not come from stolen wealth. It came from the truth. We were building a solid foundation, while my family was blindly constructing a massive castle out of sand. And their castle was about to face a hurricane they never saw coming. Julian and I did not just share a massive toxic secret regarding my family. We quickly established a highly efficient professional rhythm. I spent my days as an estate liquidator, walking through ruined mansions and cataloging the physical wreckage of wealthy families. Julian ran his newly launched independent compliance firm, auditing those exact same types of estates to ensure the financial ledgers were completely clean. We naturally started referring high net worth clients to each other. Whenever I found a suspicious property deed hidden in a foreclosed Wyzetta estate, I handed the paperwork directly to Julian. Whenever he needed a physical valuation of a hidden commercial asset to complete an investigation, he immediately called me. We became a flawless machine. We were two professionals who had been violently discarded by the exact same corrupt corporate and family systems. We found our ultimate power in dismantling those systems, piece by piece, alongside each other. Working with Julian was the absolute opposite of existing in the same room as Derek. My former fiancé was a man who sucked the oxygen out of every space he entered. Derek wore oversized luxury watches and custom-tailored suits that cost more than a standard mortgage payment. He constantly bragged about his golf handicap, his quarterly bonuses, and his connections to local politicians. Derek viewed every conversation as a competition he needed to aggressively win. Julian was entirely different. Julian grew up in a working-class neighborhood, watching his parents work grueling factory shifts just to keep the heating bills paid during the freezing Minnesota winters. He understood the actual, tangible value of a hard-earned dollar. He did not care about impressing arrogant country club members. He wore simple navy sweaters and drove a reliable domestic sedan. He never talked over me during our joint client meetings. He actually listened. And most importantly, he never once made my severe emotional baggage feel like an annoying burden. The trauma of my past did not just magically vanish overnight because I found a new business partner. My nervous system was completely wrecked from a lifetime of my mother Helen demanding absolute perfection. There were certain afternoons when a specific smell of expensive cologne or a loud demanding voice in a boardroom would trigger a massive, paralyzing panic attack. One Tuesday afternoon, Julian and I were conducting a joint audit on a commercial warehouse property. The property was owned by a notoriously arrogant patriarch who sounded and acted exactly like my father Richard. The man started shouting at me across the conference table over a minor valuation discrepancy. He pointed his finger directly at my face and told me I was incompetent. My chest instantly tightened. My vision started to blur at the edges. I completely expected Julian to lean over and tell me to calm down and stop making a scene because that was exactly what my father always did. Instead, Julian smoothly stepped right between me and the screaming client. He did not raise his voice to match the anger in the room. He simply opened his leather briefcase, pulled out a stack of strict federal tax regulations, and methodically dismantled the wealthy man argument using cold, undeniable facts. Julian cornered the man with logic until the client was forced to sit down and apologize. Julian protected me without ever making me feel weak. He grounded my spiraling panic in absolute reality. That was the exact moment I realized I was falling in love with him. Slowly, the jagged, bleeding edges of my betrayal began to heal. We bonded over our shared refusal to play corporate games and our deep disgust for blind, toxic family loyalty. We built our relationship on a foundation of total transparency. I never had to check his cell phone late at night. I never had to wonder where he was on a Friday evening. We spent our weekends cooking dinner together in my small kitchen, mapping out our future, and ignoring the ridiculous society events my family always forced me to attend. The absence of drama felt like a massive weight lifted off my shoulders. A full year after I walked out of my parents' grand foyer, Julian came into my appraisal office. It was a rainy, quiet evening in late October. My staff had already gone home for the day. There was no hidden photographer lurking in the bushes. There was no expensive vintage champagne waiting on ice. There was no fake public spectacle designed to generate social media attention. Julian just walked in, closed the heavy wooden door behind him, and sat across my desk. He looked at me with those incredibly steady eyes and asked if I wanted to build a permanent, secure life together. He asked me to marry him. I did not hesitate for a single second. I did not need to consult my parents or worry about how the announcement would look in the local newspaper. I just leaned across my desk and said yes. We immediately agreed on the non-negotiable terms of our wedding. We wanted a small, elegant ceremony overlooking the beautiful waters of Lake Minnetonka. We wanted to surround ourselves only with people who actively supported our peace. And we established one strict, unbreakable rule for the guest list. Absolutely no one from my family would receive an invitation. Not my mother, not my father, and certainly not my sister Vanessa. Making that decision felt incredibly liberating. For my entire life, Helen and Richard had used their conditional love to control my every move. They used event invitations as weapons to punish or reward behavior. By completely locking them out of the most important day of my life, I was officially severing their power over me. We decided to keep the wedding planning entirely secret. We did not post anything online. We did not wear flashy engagement rings in public. We simply hired our favorite local vendors, paid the deposits, and quietly prepared for our new chapter. However, keeping a secret in a wealthy, gossip-obsessed Minnesota suburb is nearly impossible. We kept the details tightly locked down, but in these elite social circles, someone always eventually talks. A loose-lipped florist or a careless catering assistant can destroy months of careful planning in a matter of seconds. I knew that the moment my mother found out I was moving on building a successful life and getting married without her explicit permission, she would view it as a massive declaration of war. Helen could not tolerate the idea of me finding happiness outside of her control. She would try to crush it just to prove she was still in charge. I was completely correct. 2 months before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my phone rang late on a Wednesday afternoon. The caller ID showed the name of my lead floral designer. When I answered the phone, the woman was practically hyperventilating. The sabotage had officially begun, and my mother was launching her first desperate attack to ruin my perfect day. The screen of my phone lit up with the name of my lead floral designer. Her name was Maria, and she handled the most exclusive events in the Twin Cities. I picked up the device, expecting a simple question about the table arrangements. Instead, I heard Maria breathing heavily into the receiver. Her voice was shaking so badly she could barely form a coherent sentence. She told me she was so sorry and asked if I was okay. I sat up straight in my desk chair and asked her exactly what she meant. Maria took a ragged breath and confessed that a woman claiming to be my mother had just called her shop. Helen had confidently instructed the florist to cancel the entire $30,000 order. My mother spun a beautiful, tragic lie. She told Maria that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown and the wedding was permanently canceled. My blood ran completely cold. I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk. News travels incredibly fast in the wealthy suburbs of Minnesota. There are no actual secrets in Edina or Wayzata. The local country club is essentially a massive gossip exchange where bored rich women trade rumors over expensive glasses of Chardonnay. I had been extremely careful to keep my wedding plans hidden, but someone must have seen me touring the historic estate or meeting with the caterer. That information eventually trickled right into the manicured hands of my mother. Helen realized I was engaged. She realized I was planning a beautiful, elegant future, and I was doing it entirely without her permission. For my entire life, my mother maintained her dominance by controlling the purse strings. She truly believed I would fail without her financial backing. When I walked out of her house a year ago, she fully expected me to fall apart. She wanted me to lose my business, drain my savings, and eventually come crawling back to her massive front door, begging for a check and a blessing. Helen needed me to be weak so she could feel powerful. The realization that I was thriving completely destroyed her fragile ego. She could not stand the idea of her discarded daughter hosting a spectacular event while she was not invited to take the credit. So she decided to burn my wedding to the ground. She thought that if she canceled my vendors and ruined my contracts, I would have a panic attack and call her for help. 10 years ago, I would have done exactly that. I would have called her, crying, begging her to stop ruining my life. I would have played right into her toxic trap. But the woman sitting in that appraisal office was no longer a frightened child. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I looked across the room at Julian. He was sitting on the leather sofa, reviewing a client file. He saw the expression on my face and immediately set his paperwork down. I told him what my mother had just done. Julian did not get angry. His jaw simply tightened into a hard line. He opened his laptop and told me we were going to lock down the entire perimeter. We did not call Helen to argue. Arguing with a narcissist is like pouring gasoline on a grease fire. It only gives them the exact attention they crave. Instead, Julian and I instituted a strict password protection protocol. We spent the next 3 hours calling every single vendor associated with our ceremony. I spoke to the caterer, the venue manager, the string quartet, and the rental company. I explained that an estranged relative was actively attempting to sabotage the event. I gave each vendor a specific random word. I explicitly instructed them that unless they heard that exact password, they were to ignore any request to alter, cancel, or modify my contracts. I told them to completely disregard anyone claiming to be my mother, my father, or my sister. The vendors were entirely sympathetic. People in the wedding industry have seen every type of toxic family drama imaginable. They immediately updated their files and locked my accounts. We built an impenetrable fortress around our special day. Julian sat right beside me the entire time, tracking the confirmations on his spreadsheet. Every time my anxiety threatened to bubble up, he simply placed his warm hand over mine and anchored me to reality. We handled the crisis with cold, airtight logistics. Our security measures were tested almost immediately. Helen was absolutely relentless. 2 days after the florist incident, my caterer received a highly suspicious email. The message was sent from a newly created address that looked very similar to my own. The email requested a massive menu change, asking to replace the elegant filet mignon with cheap appetizers. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to humiliate me in front of my high society guests. The caterer demanded the password. The sender could not provide it, so the caterer immediately flagged the email and notified me. Later that same week, the venue manager received a phone call from an older man claiming to be Richard Clark. My father proudly announced he was paying the final bill and demanded to shift the event date to a random Tuesday. My father thought his deep, authoritative voice would intimidate the event coordinator into compliance. The manager calmly asked for the security password. When my father demanded respect instead of providing the code, the manager hung up on him. Every single attack my family launched slammed directly into a solid brick wall. They could not breach our defenses. They could not reach me emotionally or financially. Julian and I neutralized their chaos with absolute silence. We did not send them angry text messages. We did not threaten to call the police. We simply let them scream into the void while we continued to build our beautiful life. The sheer frustration of failing to control me was driving Helen completely insane. She was losing her grip on her perfect narrative. But her petty sabotage was only the beginning of the storm. The country club whispers were getting louder. The rumors were spreading beyond the floral arrangements and the catering menus. People were starting to talk about the man I was marrying. The society gossips were busy digging up details about the groom. They discovered he ran an independent compliance firm. They discovered he used to work in the high-stakes wealth management sector. It was only a matter of time before those specific details reached the ears of my former fiancé. Derek was currently playing the role of the perfect husband to my sister Vanessa. He was busy managing my father's massive fraudulent portfolio. He thought he was completely safe. He thought he had successfully buried his financial crimes when he got Julian fired a year ago. But the country club gossip network is ruthless and fast. I knew that soon Derek would hear the name Julian Sterling mentioned in connection with my wedding. And when that happened, the desperate, petty attacks from my mother would completely stop. They would be instantly replaced by the raw, blinding panic of a cornered criminal realizing his executioner was waiting in the shadows. The whispers in the wealthy suburbs finally accomplished what my mother could not. The gossip network delivered the one piece of information I had been carefully guarding: the name of my groom. Exactly 1 week before my wedding, my sister Vanessa was sitting at a corner table inside the Adina Country Club. She was surrounded by her usual audience of bored, rich women. Vanessa lived for these lunches. She spent her entire adult life treating social gatherings like a competitive sport. She loved flashing the massive diamond Derek bought with my father's stolen retirement money. She thrived on being the center of attention. But on this specific Tuesday afternoon, the conversation suddenly shifted away from her. One of the older women at the table leaned forward and mentioned my name. The woman told the group that she had just heard a fascinating rumor. She announced that Bernice Clark was not just getting married, but she was marrying a man named Julian Sterling. The woman described Julian as a brilliant rising star in the local financial sector. She talked about his successful independent compliance firm and how he was quietly taking over major corporate accounts. Vanessa hated hearing my name. She hated the idea that I was surviving without her pity. But she was also incredibly shallow. She did not recognize the name Julian Sterling. When Julian worked at Derek's old firm, he was a silent compliance officer who stayed in the background. Vanessa only paid attention to loud men with flashy cars. She listened to the women praise Julian, and a toxic, bitter jealousy began to boil in her stomach. She could not stand the thought of me marrying a successful, respected man. She needed to tear it down. Vanessa left the country club and drove her leased luxury SUV straight back to the sprawling 5-bedroom house she shared with Derek. She stomped into the living room, where Derek was sitting on the leather sofa. Derek was holding a glass of expensive scotch and staring blindly at his laptop screen. He was desperately trying to move phantom money around to cover the massive losses in my father's portfolio. The financial walls were slowly closing in on him. Vanessa threw her designer handbag onto the kitchen island and loudly complained about her terrible lunch. She told Derek that everyone at the club was talking about my upcoming wedding. Then she sneered and dropped the name. She told her husband that I was apparently marrying some local financial hotshot named Julian Sterling. The heavy crystal glass slipped right out of Derek's hand. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending sharp shards of glass and expensive liquor everywhere. Derek did not even look at the mess. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, chalky white. The slick, confident arrogance he wore like a uniform completely evaporated. He stood up from the sofa, his chest heaving with sudden, frantic breaths. Julian Sterling. Out of all the men in the entire state of Minnesota, I was marrying the exact man Derek had falsely accused and fired. I was marrying the only forensic auditor who had actually seen the true, horrifying numbers inside the Clark family trust. Derek knew exactly how smart Julian was. He knew Julian possessed a photographic memory for financial ledgers, and more importantly, Derek realized that Julian and I were not just planning a wedding. We were a massive, terrifying liability. Derek assumed we had spent the last year putting the pieces of his criminal enterprise together. The primal, blinding terror of a cornered fraudster violently seized control of Derek's nervous system. His breathing turned shallow and erratic. He looked at Vanessa and saw a spoiled, clueless woman who had absolutely no idea her beautiful life was funded by federal wire fraud. Vanessa frowned at him. She asked him why he was acting so strange over a dropped glass. She complained that he was ruining her mood. Derek walked across the room and grabbed Vanessa by the shoulders. His grip was entirely too tight. His fingers dug into her expensive silk blouse. He looked her right in the eyes, and his voice shook with a raw, desperate energy. He told her she absolutely could not go anywhere near my wedding. Vanessa stared at him in complete shock. She had spent the last 3 weeks secretly plotting to show up at my venue. She had been brainstorming exactly how to disrupt my ceremony and remind everyone that she was the golden child who won the ultimate prize. She wanted to stand in the back of the room dripping in diamonds and watch me settle for what she assumed was a pathetic second choice. When Derek ordered her to stay away, Vanessa's ego immediately flared into a defensive rage. She pushed his hands off her shoulders. She demanded to know why he was telling her what to do. Derek could not tell her the truth. He could not confess that he was a thief. He could not admit that he had stolen her father's retirement fund and that Julian possessed the exact evidence needed to send him to a federal penitentiary for a decade. He was completely trapped by his own massive web of lies. So he frantically pivoted to the only strategy he knew. He used his old, manipulative gaslighting tactics. Derek lowered his voice and tried to sound like a commanding, protective husband. He told Vanessa that my wedding was going to be a toxic, embarrassing disaster. He lied and said he knew Julian from the old firm and claimed Julian was a bitter, unstable loser who was only marrying me to get back at the family. Derek insisted that if Vanessa showed up, she would be validating my pathetic choices. He framed his absolute terror as a desire to protect their elite public image. He begged her to just trust him. He repeated that phrase over and over again. "Trust me, Vanessa. We cannot be associated with them. Stay away." It was the exact same phrase he used when he convinced my parents to let him switch sisters. Trust me. But this time the manipulation spectacularly failed. Vanessa did not hear a protective husband guarding their social status. She heard something entirely different. Her deeply ingrained narcissism violently twisted his words. Vanessa analyzed his frantic behavior and came to a completely delusional conclusion. She genuinely believed Derek was trying to protect me. In her twisted mind, she thought Derek felt sorry for his discarded ex-fiancé. She assumed Derek knew that if his beautiful, successful wife walked into that wedding venue, all eyes would instantly turn to her. Vanessa convinced herself that Derek was begging her to stay home simply because he did not want her to outshine me on my special day. She thought Derek was trying to spare my feelings and prevent me from feeling like a total failure next to her magnificent presence. The sheer insult of that imagined scenario drove Vanessa completely insane. She had spent her whole life competing with me and winning. The idea that her own husband wanted her to step aside and let me have a moment of glory was absolutely intolerable. She was the golden child. She was the ultimate winner. She refused to hide in her house while I celebrated a new life. Vanessa glared at Derek. She told him he was being ridiculous. She announced that she was going to do whatever she wanted. Derek tried to argue. He followed her up the grand staircase, his voice pitching higher with every step. He pleaded with her, telling her it was a massive mistake. He warned her that she had no idea what kind of mess she was walking into. But his desperate pleading only fueled her arrogant fire. Every time he asked her to stay away, it just cemented her absolute determination to go. Vanessa slammed the bedroom door in his face. She walked directly into her massive walk-in closet and began pulling heavy, expensive gowns off the hangers. She did not just want to attend my wedding anymore. She wanted to completely hijack it. She wanted to walk through those venue doors and force every single person in the room to acknowledge her superiority. She decided to crash the ceremony. She wanted to look the groom up and down and laugh in his face. She wanted to prove to everyone that she had stolen the best man and left me with scraps. She spent the next 3 days secretly preparing for her grand ambush. She purchased an outrageously heavy emerald green gown that was entirely inappropriate for a tasteful daytime wedding. She rented extra diamond bracelets to stack on her wrists. She wanted to look like a walking advertisement for conspicuous wealth. She was completely intoxicated by her own fabricated power. She had absolutely no idea that she was dressing up for her own public execution. While Vanessa was busy picking out rented jewelry to destroy my day, Derek was rapidly losing his mind. He stopped going to his financial office. He sat in his dark living room, drinking constantly and staring at his phone. He knew he could not stop his wife. He knew Vanessa was going to walk right into a room filled with Julian allies. Derek realized his beautiful, fraudulent empire was currently resting entirely in the manicured hands of an arrogant woman who possessed zero self-awareness. The week before the wedding slowly ticked by. Julian and I remained completely silent, finishing our elegant preparations. My mother had stopped trying to cancel my vendors. She was likely sitting in her own house fuming over her lack of control. But the real storm was brewing inside Vanessa. Her desperate need for attention had finally overridden Derek's desperate need for survival. The morning of my wedding arrived bright and cold. The stage was perfectly set. I was standing in a private room at the historic estate, waiting to walk down the aisle. I did not know Vanessa was coming, but Julian and I had prepared for every possible attack. We were completely ready, and as the heavy wooden doors of the venue finally swung open, the ultimate disaster my family had been blindly rushing toward for an entire year was about to violently pull them under. The morning of my wedding was entirely different from the nightmare I had lived a year ago. There was no chaotic rushing. There were no frantic phone calls from my mother demanding that I change the seating chart to accommodate her wealthy friends. There was absolutely no anxiety twisting in my stomach. The air outside was crisp and freezing, but inside, the historic estate overlooking Lake Minnetonka, everything was incredibly warm and perfectly still. I stood in the private bridal suite, looking out the tall glass windows at the frozen water. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had spent my entire life managing disasters for my family and fixing their messes. Today, I did not have to fix a single thing. My business partner Sarah stood behind me, adjusting the back of my dress. I did not purchase a massive, elaborate gown. I did not want anything that resembled the heavy ivory dress my sister had stolen and altered behind my back. Instead, I wore a simple, unbranded silk dress. It was sleek and understated. It carried absolutely no designer label, and it screamed absolutely nothing. It was the dress of a woman who had nothing left to prove to anyone. Sarah smoothed the fabric down and looked at my reflection in the tall mirror. She did not give me a sappy, emotional speech. She just squeezed my shoulder and told me I looked like a woman who finally owned her own life. I walked out of the suite and headed toward the main hall. I did not have my father Richard waiting to walk me down the aisle. He had forfeited that right the night he told me to move on so he could protect his retirement fund. I was walking myself down the aisle, and I preferred it that way. The main hall of the historic estate was breathtaking. We had kept the guest list to exactly 80 people. There were no fake country club acquaintances. There were no toxic relatives holding drinks and waiting for drama. The room was filled strictly with people who had proven their loyalty. My most trusted clients and friends sat on the left side. On the right side sat Julian's closest allies. Many of the people on his side were powerful senior partners and managing directors from the financial sector. These were the exact men and women who had watched Derek push Julian out of the firm a year ago. They were the people who knew the truth about Julian integrity. They were quiet, wealthy, and incredibly observant. I walked down the aisle to the sound of a live string quartet. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the front of the room. Julian was waiting for me at the altar. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit. He did not look nervous. He looked at me with the exact same steady, grounding focus that had saved me from a panic attack in that commercial warehouse months ago. I reached the front of the room and placed my hands in his. His grip was warm and solid. The officiant smiled and began to speak. The atmosphere was completely peaceful. It felt like a protective bubble had been permanently sealed around us. But a predator cannot stand the sight of prey living peacefully. Just as the officiant asked us to turn and face each other for the reading of the vows, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the back of the hall. The heavy oak doors at the entrance were shoved violently open. The string quartet immediately faltered. A sharp gust of freezing Minnesota wind rushed into the warm room, causing the candle flames lining the aisle to flicker wildly. The 80 guests turned in their wooden pews to look at the disruption. I did not turn around immediately. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling Julian tighten his grip on my fingers. He knew exactly what was happening without even looking. I slowly turned my head and looked down the long center aisle. My sister Vanessa was standing in the doorway. She was a spectacular vision of desperate, fabricated wealth. She was wearing a massive, heavy, emerald green gown that looked entirely ridiculous for an elegant daytime ceremony. The dress was too loud, too bright, and completely inappropriate. Her wrists and neck were absolutely dripping in thick diamond jewelry. I recognized the pieces immediately. They were high-end rental items from a boutique in Wayzata. Vanessa had literally rented a fortune just to crash my wedding. She stood in the doorway, letting the cold wind blow her perfectly styled hair. She had a smug, pitying smile stretched tightly across her face. She was practically vibrating with toxic excitement. She had spent the last 3 days convincing herself that Derek begged her to stay home because he felt sorry for me. She genuinely believed she was walking into a room full of cheap folding chairs and pathetic, broke losers. She wanted to disrupt my peace. She wanted to walk down the aisle, steal the spotlight, and watch me completely crumble in the presence of the ultimate winner. The venue's security guard immediately stepped out from the shadows near the coat check. He reached for Vanessa's arm to physically escort her out of the building. He looked directly at me, waiting for the signal to throw her out into the cold. I looked at the guard and gave a tiny, barely perceptible shake of my head. I did not want her removed. I did not want to protect her from the absolute devastation she was about to walk into. She had spent a year building a beautiful fake life, funded by stolen money and a stolen fiancé. She wanted an audience. I was going to give her one. I wanted her to stay and look at the exact reality she had blindly ignored. Vanessa shrugged off the security guard with a dramatic, arrogant toss of her head. She gripped her expensive clutch and took her first confident step down the center aisle. She was ready to put on a show, but as she walked further into the room, her smug smile began to falter. She started scanning the crowd, expecting to see people she could look down on. She expected to see me marrying some miserable, struggling man surrounded by equally miserable friends. But as her eyes darted from pew to pew, the aggressive confidence began to rapidly drain from her face. She did not see cheap suits. She saw bespoke tailoring. She saw women holding authentic luxury handbags that cost more than her leased SUV. She saw quiet, immense wealth staring back at her with absolute disgust. Then Vanessa recognized a face in the third row. It was a senior managing director from the wealth management firm where Derek currently worked. It was a man who held Derek's entire career in his hands. The director was not smiling. He was glaring at Vanessa's emerald gown with complete professional contempt. Vanessa's steps grew significantly slower. Her heavy diamond bracelets clattered noisily in the dead silence of the room. The grand theatrical entrance she had imagined in her head was rapidly turning into a suffocating nightmare. The floor of the historic estate seemed to tilt beneath her expensive heels. She was entirely surrounded by the very people Derek had spent the last year trying to manipulate and deceive. She finally realized that something was horribly wrong. She realized Derek had not ordered her to stay home to protect my feelings. Derek had ordered her to stay home because he was terrified of this exact room. Vanessa reached the halfway point of the aisle. Her breathing became visible in her chest. The arrogant golden child was suddenly shrinking under the weight of 80 silent, evaluating stares. She desperately needed an anchor. She needed someone to look at and project her remaining false superiority onto. She turned her frantic eyes away from the wealthy guests and looked directly at the altar. She looked at my simple, unbranded silk dress. She looked at my calm expression. I was not crying. I was not shrinking. I was standing perfectly straight, holding the hand of the groom. I did not flinch. I just watched her unravel in real time. Vanessa slowly dragged her eyes up my arm, tracing the connection of our hands. She finally forced herself to look at the face of the man I was marrying. She wanted to see a failure. She wanted to see a pathetic placeholder who could never measure up to the glorious, wealthy husband she had stolen from me. She looked up. Her eyes locked directly on to Julian Sterling, the man her husband had fired. The forensic auditor who knew every single buried secret in the Clark family trust. The quiet watchdog who had spent the last year building a federal financial case against the very life she was currently wearing. I stood at the altar holding Julian's hand and watched the exact second my sister stopped breathing. I stood at the altar holding Julian's hand and watched the exact second my sister stopped breathing. The rosy flush of arrogant victory completely drained from Vanessa's perfectly contoured face. It left behind a sickening chalky pallor that made her heavy makeup look like a cheap plastic mask. Her mouth parted slightly, but absolutely no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed, staring directly at the groom. Vanessa knew exactly who Julian Sterling was. A year ago, Derek had come home to our parents' house and proudly announced he had successfully terminated a bitter, jealous compliance officer at his firm. Derek had literally popped a bottle of expensive vintage champagne in my mother's grand kitchen to celebrate getting Julian fired. Vanessa had eagerly drank that champagne. She had eagerly absorbed Derek's fabricated story about a pathetic loser who tried to sabotage the top earners out of pure spite. She had fully accepted the narrative that Julian was a disgraced failure who had been permanently banished from their elite social circle. For one singular, microscopic fraction of a second, Vanessa's deeply ingrained narcissism attempted to protect her from reality. A twisted, brittle smile actually flickered across her glossy lips. Her eyes darted rapidly from Julian's face back to mine. I could literally see the wheels turning in her shallow mind. She genuinely thought I was standing at the altar, marrying an unemployed failure out of sheer, desperate loneliness. She assumed I had scraped the absolute bottom of the barrel just to avoid being a spinster. She believed she had just won the ultimate victory. She thought she was about to publicly humiliate me for settling for a man her husband had destroyed. But that delusional, triumphant smile died before it could fully form on her face. Vanessa finally forced her eyes away from the altar and looked at the guests seated in the first 3 rows on the groom's side of the center aisle. She expected to see a collection of miserable, struggling friends. She expected to see cheap suits and pitying stares. Instead, she was met with a wall of quiet, immense, intimidating power. The men and women sitting in those front wooden pews were titans of the local financial industry. They were the senior managing partners, the executive directors, and the chief compliance officers from the exact same corporate wealth management firm where Derek currently worked. These were the people who signed Derek paychecks. These were the executives who dictated his entire professional future. These were the individuals who held the absolute power to approve or destroy a career. And right now, every single one of those powerful individuals was sitting respectfully at Julian's wedding. They were not dressed in flashy rented designer clothes. They wore bespoke, tailored suits and understated luxury watches that cost more than Vanessa's leased vehicle. They radiated the kind of quiet, generational wealth my parents had spent their entire lives desperately trying to imitate. The managing director of the firm was a man who possessed a legendary reputation for utter ruthlessness. He was sitting directly in the front row. He did not look at Vanessa with polite curiosity. He looked at her heavy rented emerald gown and her stacks of rented diamond bracelets with profound, absolute disgust. He looked at her like she was a piece of toxic garbage that had just blown through the beautiful venue doors. He did not see a glamorous, wealthy socialite. He saw the clueless, greedy wife of a man who was actively under federal investigation. The physical reality of the room hit my sister like a freight train. The polished hardwood floor beneath her expensive designer heels seemed to violently drop away. Her chest began to heave as her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. The massive, heavy truth finally crushed her carefully constructed, fabricated reality. Derek had not begged her to stay away from this historic estate to protect my fragile feelings. Derek had not ordered her to stay home because he was worried she would outshine the bride. Derek was utterly paralyzed with fear. He was completely terrified of Julian Sterling. Vanessa's mind began to rapidly calculate the terrifying math. If the highest-ranking partners from Derek firm were proudly sitting at Julian's wedding, it meant Julian was not a disgraced liar. It meant Julian was highly respected. It meant Julian possessed massive professional power, and if Julian possessed power, it meant Derek was completely, entirely vulnerable. The beautiful, luxurious life Vanessa had stolen from me was not a permanent victory. It was a fragile house of cards built on a foundation of stolen money and federal wire fraud. And she had just blindly walked directly into the exact room where the people holding the matches were gathered. The crushing weight of the rented diamonds on her wrists suddenly felt like heavy steel handcuffs. The lavish green silk dress she wore to humiliate me felt like a suffocating straitjacket. She was completely exposed in front of the most powerful people in her husband's professional circle. The silence in the room was absolute. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. The only sound was the faint crackle of the decorative candles burning near the altar, and the frantic, hyperventilating breaths escaping from Vanessa's throat. A normal, rational person would have recognized the catastrophic danger. A normal person would have lowered their head, turned around, and quietly walked out the heavy oak doors. They would have retreated into the freezing Minnesota winter air to salvage whatever tiny shred of dignity they had left. They would have rushed home to demand the truth from their husband. But Vanessa was not a normal person. She was a deeply spoiled, entitled woman who had never faced a single real consequence in her entire 32 years of existence. My mother, Helen, had always trained her to loudly attack whenever she felt cornered or threatened. My mother taught her that sheer volume and aggressive behavior could overwrite any inconvenient truth. Vanessa had spent her whole life believing that if she screamed loud enough, the world would simply bend to her will. She could not process the fact that she was the fool. Her ego simply would not allow her to accept that she had been used as a pathetic pawn in a massive financial scam. She needed someone else to be the villain. She needed to drag the narrative back into her control. Vanessa completely lost her composure. The polished, elite country club facade shattered into a million jagged pieces right there in the middle of the center aisle. She took a fierce, aggressive step forward, closing the distance between the guest seating and the altar. She raised her right arm and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Julian's face. Her eyes were wide and frantic, completely devoid of any rational thought. She ignored the 80 silent guests watching her meltdown. She ignored the furious glare of the venue security guard, who was stepping out from the shadows to intercept her. She completely ignored the serene, peaceful expression on my face. She opened her mouth, and a harsh, shrill scream tore violently from her throat. "He is a liar!" she shouted. Her voice echoed sharply against the high vaulted ceilings of the historic estate, shattering the elegant peace we had built. She jabbed her pointing finger through the air, as if trying to physically stab Julian with her accusation. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. She refused to look at the powerful executive sitting just feet away from her. She kept her wild eyes locked entirely on the groom. "He is a liar." She screamed again, her voice cracking under the intense strain of her own panic. "He tried to destroy husband." She stood there, chest heaving, waiting for the room to erupt in chaos. She waited for the guests to gasp in shock and turn against the man standing beside me. She expected her loud, aggressive accusation to completely ruin the ceremony and restore her position as the ultimate victor. She demanded that the universe acknowledge her fabricated truth. But the universe was officially done protecting her. The harsh, shrill sound of my sister screaming echoed violently against the high, vaulted ceilings of the historic estate. Her voice bounced off the massive glass windows and faded into a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The string quartet players immediately stopped moving. The lead cellist actually placed his hand flat over his strings to forcefully kill the lingering vibration of the music. The room went entirely dead silent. It was not just a quiet pause. It was the terrifying, absolute stillness that follows a massive car crash. Vanessa stood in the center aisle with her trembling finger still pointed directly at Julian's face. Her chest was heaving with frantic, ragged breaths. She was completely convinced that her loud, aggressive accusation was going to turn the entire room against the groom. She waited for the 80 loyal guests to gasp in shock. She waited for the murmurs of outrage. She expected people to demand answers from the man standing beside me. She truly believed that screaming the word liar was enough to rewrite reality. Julian did not flinch. He did not take a defensive step backward. He did not raise his hands or open his mouth to argue with a hysterical woman throwing a temper tantrum in the middle of a wedding. When a man holds the absolute, undeniable truth in his hands, he does not need to yell to prove his point. Julian simply lowered his gaze from her pointing finger and looked directly into her terrified, manic eyes. He did not look angry. He did not look insulted. He looked at my sister with a profound, freezing pity. It was the exact expression a person wears when they watch a clueless driver accelerate directly toward a missing bridge. Before I could even take a breath to speak, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted again. The sharp sound of a heavy wooden pew creaking shattered the silence. An older gentleman sitting in the second row on the groom's side slowly stood up. He was a man in his late 60s, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that radiated quiet generational wealth. This was Thomas. He was the senior managing director from Derek's former wealth management firm. He was a man who personally controlled billions of dollars in corporate assets. More importantly, he was the exact executive who had signed the paperwork terminating Julian a year ago, based on Derek's fabricated lies. Thomas had spent the last 12 months realizing he had been played for an absolute fool by a smooth-talking fraudster. The director buttoned his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate motion. He stepped out of the wooden pew and moved into the center aisle, directly facing my sister. He possessed a deeply intimidating presence. He did not look angry. He looked like a federal judge preparing to hand down a terminal sentence to a guilty defendant. He spoke with a deep, resonant authority that carried effortlessly to the very back of the hall. He did not yell. He did not match her frantic, hysterical energy. He stated the facts with brutal, surgical precision. He looked Vanessa right in the eyes and said, "Julian Sterling is not a liar." Vanessa's mouth dropped open. She tried to formulate a response, but the older man simply raised his hand and silenced her instantly. His voice cut through the air like a heavy steel blade. "We reviewed the internal audits last month," he continued, his tone completely devoid of any sympathy. "We initiated a deep-dive forensic investigation into your husband-client accounts. Your husband has been actively stealing from his own clients for 3 consecutive years. He is running a massive illegal shell game with unauthorized leverage." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. A collective sharp gasp echoed through the historic estate. The guests sitting on my side of the aisle stared at Vanessa in absolute, unadulterated horror. They were looking at a woman dripping in rented diamonds, funded by stolen money. The corporate executives sitting on Julian's side simply nodded in grim agreement. They already knew the dark truth. They had come to this wedding specifically to honor Julian and to quietly apologize for doubting his integrity. Thomas was not finished. He delivered the final, fatal blow to the beautiful fake empire Vanessa had built. "Derek is not a victim," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a cold, deadly register. "Your husband is currently under active federal investigation by the authorities. The wire fraud indictments are being drafted as we speak." The physical reaction from my sister was immediate and violent. She literally stumbled backward, as if the older man had reached out and shoved her directly in the chest. Her expensive designer heels caught on the thick fabric of the aisle runner. She completely lost her balance and staggered sideways. She threw her arms out to catch herself, and her wrists slammed against the edge of the solid oak pews. The heavy rented diamond bracelets stacked on her arms clattered loudly against the hardwood. The sharp scraping noise echoed through the silent room. It was the perfect auditory representation of her fabricated wealth colliding with brutal reality. Vanessa's grand theatrical interruption was completely dead. She had walked through those heavy oak doors, intending to stage a glorious public humiliation for her discarded older sister. She wanted to prove she was the ultimate golden child who stole the ultimate prize. Instead, she had just voluntarily walked onto a public execution block. Her entrance had turned into a spectacular, highly public dismantling of her own pathetic life. She had just screamed that her husband was an innocent victim to the exact men who possessed his fraudulent bank records. She had tried to humiliate the forensic auditor, who held the literal keys to her husband's federal prison cell. Pure, blinding panic entirely consumed her. Her chest heaved so violently the heavy emerald silk of her inappropriate gown strained against her ribs. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. She began scanning the back rows, the side aisles, and the corners of the venue. She was desperately searching for an ally. She was looking for a savior. For 32 years, whenever Vanessa made a catastrophic mistake, our parents immediately rushed in to fix it. If Vanessa threw a humiliating temper tantrum in public, our mother Helen would loudly demand that everyone apologize to her golden child. If Vanessa broke something expensive, our father Richard would quickly throw his checkbook at the problem until it magically went away. They had trained her to believe that she was completely immune to the consequences of her own terrible actions. Vanessa frantically searched the faces in the crowd, expecting our mother to jump up from a pew and defend her honor. She expected our father to march down the aisle and threaten the managing director with a massive defamation lawsuit. She needed them to spin the narrative. She needed them to bully these wealthy strangers into submission. But the wooden pews were filled strictly with loyal friends and corporate executives. My parents were not there to save her. They were not there to tell the managing director to back down. They were not there to wrap their arms around her and tell her everything was going to be fine. They were completely absent because I had established a firm, unyielding boundary. I had permanently banned them from my life. I had explicitly refused to give them a seat at my table. By aggressively cutting my toxic parents out of my wedding, I had inadvertently stripped my sister of her only human shields. She was standing in a room full of powerful, untouchable people who despised her husband, and she was entirely, completely alone. She had no leverage. She had no backup. She had no wealthy father to bail her out. The reality of her total isolation finally broke her fragile, narcissistic mind. She realized she could not fight the managing director. She realized she could not scream at the wealthy corporate guests staring at her with disgust. She was trapped. So she did the only thing a desperate, cornered coward knows how to do. She turned her panicked, tear-filled eyes back toward the altar. She looked at me. She looked at the older sister she had gleefully betrayed, discarded, and mocked for an entire year. She opened her trembling mouth, and her voice dropped into a pathetic, whining whisper. She begged me not to do this. She pleaded with me to think about our family. That specific phrase was the exact trigger I had been waiting for. I let go of Julian's warm hand. I took a slow, deliberate step down from the raised altar. The time for silence was completely over. It was finally time to show my sister exactly how much I knew about the ivory silk dress she stole and the horrifying text message our mother sent to seal my fate. Vanessa turned her frantic eyes toward me. The aggressive, arrogant woman who had strutted through the heavy oak doors just moments ago was entirely gone. She was shrinking inside her rented emerald gown. She looked at the powerful executives staring at her with disgust, and then she looked back at me, standing peacefully at the altar. She realized she was trapped in a nightmare she had built with her own 2 hands. Her shoulders slumped, and her voice dropped into a pathetic, whining whisper. "Please do not do this, Bernice," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "Think about the family." That specific phrase was the exact trigger I had been waiting for. Think about the family. It was the same toxic weapon our parents had used to silence me my entire life. It was the phrase our father Richard used when he told me to move on and pretend my life had not been destroyed. It was the concept our mother Helen weaponized to force me into submission. They demanded absolute loyalty to the family while secretly treating me like a disposable asset. I let go of Julian's hand. I took a slow, deliberate step down from the raised wooden altar. My unbranded silk dress rustled softly in the quiet room. I did not yell. I did not match her frantic, hysterical energy. My voice was completely level and cold. It carried effortlessly across the silent, historic estate, reaching the ears of every single guest in the pews. "Explain the dress," Vanessa said. She blinked rapidly, her thick, false eyelashes fluttering against her pale skin. She looked confused, trying to understand why I was bringing up clothing, while her husband, federal crimes, were being exposed. Explain the ivory silk wedding gown you wore coming down the stairs last year. I continued, taking another step toward her. Explain how you were professionally fitted for my exact dress 14 weeks before you accidentally fell in love with my fiancé. Vanessa froze entirely. The breath hitched violently in her throat. She stared at me like I had just pulled a loaded weapon out of thin air. I know all about the luxury boutique in downtown St. Paul, I said, watching the sheer terror bloom in her eyes. I know you used the spare key in the ceramic planter on my balcony to sneak into my apartment while I was at work. I know you stole my gown from the back of my closet and took it to Margot to have the waist taken in 2 inches and the hem raised 3 inches. I know you demanded absolute secrecy 14 weeks before my wedding was officially canceled. She stood frozen in the center aisle. The lie she had sold to her wealthy country club friends was dead. The beautiful romantic story about a spontaneous whirlwind romance was completely obliterated. How do you know that she choked out her voice barely a squeak? Her question was a massive mistake. A truly innocent person would have denied the accusation. An innocent woman would have demanded proof. But by asking how I knew, she had just inadvertently confessed to the entire room that every single word I said was true. The 80 guests sitting in the wooden pews let out a collective murmur of disgust. They were looking at a woman who had meticulously calculated the theft of her own sister's life. I did not stop. I stepped closer to her, closing the physical distance. I wanted her to hear every single syllable clearly. You thought you were so incredibly clever, I said, my tone flat and clinical. You thought you stole a magnificent prize because you were the prettier, younger daughter. You genuinely believed Derek chose you out of overwhelming passion. But you were never the grand romantic victor, Vanessa. I paused, letting the heavy silence wrap around her. Mom picked you the exact second I stopped being useful to the portfolio, I said. Vanessa frowned, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She shook her head, trying to deny the reality forming in front of her. She tried to tell me I was crazy and that our parents supported her true love. I reached into my memory and pulled out the exact words from the screenshot she had so arrogantly sent me months ago. I recited the text message verbatim, watching her face closely as the recognition hit her. He controls the family trust, I quoted, letting the words echo in the high vaulted room. Do not let him get away. We will handle Bernice. Vanessa's mouth fell open. She recognized the words immediately. It was the exact text message she had forwarded to me to brag about our mother supporting her engagement. She had thought it was a maternal blessing. She had been too incredibly shallow and blind to read the actual meaning behind the words. I watched her mind struggle to process the agonizing math. I forced her to connect the dots she had spent a year ignoring. Derek was losing Dad money, I explained slowly, as if teaching a very slow child. Derek was running a massive illegal shell game. The portfolio was sinking, and he needed to keep the $2.8 million trust safely under his control to prevent a federal audit. But Derek was tired of me. He wanted to break our engagement. He knew if he left me, Dad would pull the accounts out of anger, and the fraud would be instantly exposed. Vanessa's chest began to heave again. Her hands started trembling so violently, the rented diamonds clattered against each other. So, Derek made a deal with our parents, I said, stepping right into her personal space. He told them the money was in severe danger. He told them he would only guarantee the safety of their retirement fund if he remained permanently inside the family circle. He demanded a hostage to keep everyone compliant. I looked her up and down, taking in the ridiculous emerald gown and the fake glittering stones. They did not pick you because you were special, Vanessa. They sacrificed me because I was asking too many questions, and they handed you over like a corporate signing bonus. You were a human shield deployed to protect Dad's commercial real estate portfolio. You were just the collateral they used to keep a criminal out of federal prison. The realization hit her with the destructive force of a hurricane. I watched her entire worldview violently collapse in real time. For her entire life, Vanessa believed she was the golden child. She believed she was infinitely more desirable than me. She had spent a year parading around the wealthy suburbs of Minnesota, bragging about the incredible man she stole. She built her entire identity on the fact that she was the ultimate winner. Now standing in the center aisle of my wedding, she finally understood the horrifying truth. Her beautiful marriage was a massive financial transaction. Her husband did not love her. Her husband used her as a temporary life raft to survive a federal audit. And infinitely worse, our parents knew the entire time. Helen and Richard had actively sold their youngest daughter to a fraudster just to protect their bank accounts. Their parental love was nothing more than a calculated business decision. Vanessa's legs physically gave out beneath her. She dropped to her knees right there on the aisle runner. The heavy emerald silk fabric pooled around her on the floor. She wrapped her arms around her stomach as if she had just been stabbed. She let out a low, agonizing sob that sounded more like a dying animal than a human being. The sheer psychological destruction of knowing her entire existence was a cheap lie completely broke her mind. She looked up at me from the floor. Her flawless makeup was ruined by thick black tears streaming down her face. She looked like a terrified child. She was waiting for me to reach down and help her up. She was waiting for the reliable older sister to fix the massive mess and tell her everything was going to be okay. But I was done fixing things for people who treated me like garbage. I looked down at her, feeling nothing but a profound, freezing indifference. She had traded her own blood for a temporary illusion of wealth. And the ultimate tragedy of her foolish choice was that the reward she sold her soul for did not even exist anymore. "You ruined my life for a $2.8 million trust," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, deadly register that only she and the front row guests could hear. "You sold your sister to protect Dad retirement money? But you should have checked the current ledgers before you bought that ridiculous dress." Vanessa stopped crying for a second, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She did not understand what I was implying. But the guests in the front row knew exactly what was coming next. The new conflict was no longer about a stolen wedding dress or a fake romance. It was about the cold, brutal reality of federal banking laws. My family had sacrificed everything to keep their fake empire afloat. But the water had finally breached the hull, and the final, devastating wave was about to wash them all away. I stared down at the woman kneeling on the floor of my wedding venue. Vanessa looked up at me, with thick black mascara running down her cheeks. She was desperately waiting for me to take the threat back. She wanted me to laugh and tell her it was just a cruel joke. But I did not smile. I did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. I let the cold reality of her situation fill the silent room. "You are not the great love story, Vanessa," I said. My words echoed clearly across the silent hall, hitting the high vaulted ceilings and raining down on her. "You were just how they kept the money safe, and now the money gone." She shook her head rapidly. Her rented diamond earring swung wildly against her neck. She told me I was lying. She insisted that Derek was a genius portfolio manager and that our father trust fund was perfectly secure. She claimed she had just seen the account balances on Derek's computer yesterday morning. I looked at Julian. He gave me a single, quiet nod. He was giving me permission to deliver the final, devastating blow. I turned my attention back to my sister. I explained the final truth that Julian and I had confirmed just hours before I put on my wedding dress. I told her that the balances she saw on her husband's computer screen were completely fabricated. They were fake numbers, typed into a spreadsheet to keep her and our parents docile. Julian did not just show his audit reports to the managing directors sitting in this room, I explained. My voice was steady and firm. As a licensed compliance officer, Julian was legally required to submit his findings to the federal banking regulators. He handed over every single piece of evidence regarding Derek's illegal leverage and offshore transfers. The authorities do not move slowly when they see massive wire fraud. I watched her eyes widen in absolute horror as I explained the timeline. While Vanessa was sitting in a salon chair this morning getting her hair curled to crash my wedding, the federal regulators were executing a coordinated lockdown. Because of Derek's immense fraudulent leveraging, the bank formally froze Richard's entire commercial trust at 9 o'clock this morning, I said. Every single penny is locked down, pending a federal criminal investigation. The wealth our parents sacrificed me for is completely vaporized. My father Richard built his entire identity on that money. He grew up in a middle-class neighborhood and spent his entire adult life desperately clawing his way into the elite upper crust of Minnesota society. He judged every man he met by the brand of his shoes and the make of his car. He demanded total obedience from his family because he paid the bills. He threw his eldest daughter away like garbage because he was terrified of losing his country club membership. He traded his own flesh and blood for financial security, and now he had absolutely nothing. I told Vanessa exactly what was going to happen to the man who raised us. I told her that tomorrow morning, Richard will try to buy a coffee or pay for a round of golf, and his premium credit cards will be violently declined. He will call the bank, and a fraud prevention officer will inform him that his life savings have been seized by the federal government. He will finally realize that he sold his soul to a criminal for a payout that no longer exists. Vanessa grabbed the fabric of her heavy emerald gown. Her knuckles turned white. She choked on her own breath. She asked me about Derek. She demanded to know where her husband was right now. I looked at her with pure, freezing indifference. Your husband is facing federal prison, Vanessa. He is not a wealthy executive anymore. He is a desperate thief caught in a trap. He knew this was coming. That is exactly why he begged you to stay away from this wedding today. He needed you to stay out of the crossfire so he could use you as a distraction. She did not understand. She begged me to explain what I meant by a distraction. I laid out the brutal logic of a cornered criminal. I told her that Derek probably spent the entire morning packing a bag and moving whatever loose cash he had left into an untraceable account. He let you get dressed up in rented diamonds and drive here to make a fool of yourself, I said. He knew that if you came here, you would cause a massive scene and draw all the attention. You were his perfect noisy decoy. He traded you for a head start. He used you as a temporary life raft to buy himself a few hours before the federal agents knocked down the front door of your beautiful leased house. The final illusion shattered. The grand romantic fantasy she had clung to for a year dissolved into dust right in front of 80 silent guests. Vanessa realized she was completely ruined. She had no husband. She had no money. Her parents were about to be thrust into public poverty and overwhelming legal debt. The luxury cars, the country club lunches, the massive diamond ring, it was all a spectacular lie. She fell forward, catching herself on her hands. The heavy emerald fabric pooled around her on the wooden floor like a collapsed parachute. She looked like a broken porcelain doll. The arrogant golden child was finally forced to face the real world. She looked up at me from the floor. The venom and pride were entirely gone. She was stripped bare. She opened her mouth and began to beg. "Bernice, please," she sobbed. Her voice was a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You have to help me. I have nowhere to go. Derek took all the cash. The house is leased in his name. I cannot go back to Mom and Dad. They will blame me for bringing him into the family. They will destroy me when they find out the money is gone." She reached out a trembling hand and tried to grab the hem of my simple silk wedding dress. She wanted me to save her. She wanted the reliable older sister to swoop in and fix the massive mess and offer her a warm bed. "Please," she cried, the tears dripping off her chin onto the polished floor. "Tell Julian to talk to the regulators. Tell him to get the money back for Dad. Tell him to keep my name out of the federal indictment. I am your sister, Bernice. You have to protect me. I have absolutely nothing left." The guests sitting in the wooden pews watched in stunned silence. They were witnessing the total humiliation of a woman who had tried to ruin a sacred ceremony. They waited to see what I would do. They waited to see if the trauma of my past would force me to bend down and comfort the sister who betrayed me. I looked down at her hand, hovering just inches away from my dress. I did not step back. I did not kick her away. I simply stood my ground. For 32 years, I gave this family everything. I gave them my loyalty, my obedience, and my silent suffering. I organized their parties, I fixed their mistakes, and I swallowed my own pride just to keep the peace. When my heart was broken into a million pieces, they told me to stop crying and move on. They celebrated my destruction because it benefited their bank accounts. They drained me dry until I had nothing left to give. I looked my sister directly in the eyes. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of freedom wash over my entire body. I was no longer bound by their toxic rules. I was no longer responsible for their terrible choices. "I have nothing left to give you, Vanessa," I said, my voice soft but incredibly firm. "You made your choice 14 weeks before my wedding. You chose the dress, you chose the man, you chose the money. Now you get to live with the exact consequences of your own greed." She let out a loud, wailing cry and dropped her face into her hands. The sound was agonizing, but it did not touch my heart. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I just felt clean. The disease that had infected my life for over 3 decades was finally cured. I turned my head and looked at Julian. He was watching me with a look of profound respect and deep, unwavering love. He did not rush me. He gave me all the time I needed to close this dark chapter of my life. I smiled at him, a genuine, warm smile that reached all the way to my eyes. The conflict was officially over. The war was won not with shouting or violence, but with cold, hard, undeniable facts. The audience in the room was completely captivated, waiting for the final curtain to drop on this incredible drama. My sister was sobbing on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her own arrogance. My parents were sitting in their empty house, completely unaware that their wealthy empire had just been seized by the government. The villains of my story had orchestrated their own perfect demise. All I had to do now was take the final step and walk away into a beautiful, honest future. I looked down at the woman weeping on the polished hardwood floor of my wedding venue. Vanessa was clutching the heavy green fabric of her ridiculous rented gown, sobbing so violently her shoulders shook. She was waiting for me to break. She had spent her entire life watching our parents cater to her every single emotional outburst. She fully expected me to reach down, wrap my arms around her, and promise to protect her from the massive federal disaster her husband had created. But I felt absolutely nothing. I did not feel a sudden surge of angry vindication. I did not feel the fiery thrill of revenge I thought I might experience when this day finally arrived. I did not even feel a lingering trace of sorrow for the sister I used to know. I simply felt an immense, liberating weightlessness. It was the total, absolute power of pure indifference. The toxic, invisible chains that had bound me to my family for 32 years simply dissolved into thin air. I was completely free. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I did not tell her everything was going to be fine because it was not going to be fine. Her life as she knew it was entirely over. I turned my back on her. The simple physical motion of turning around was the most powerful thing I have ever done in my entire life. I walked away from the wreckage of my sister and stepped back up onto the raised wooden altar. Julian was waiting for me. He did not look at Vanessa. His eyes were locked entirely on me. He reached out and took both of my hands in his. His grip was steady, grounding, and incredibly warm. I looked out at the 80 loyal guests seated in the wooden pews. The powerful financial executives, the trusted clients, and my true friends were all watching me with profound respect. There was no pity in this room anymore. There was only absolute clarity. I turned to the officiant who was standing quietly, holding his binder. I gave him a small, polite smile. I told him we were ready to continue the ceremony. The officiant nodded. The string quartet picked up their instruments and began to play a soft, beautiful melody that instantly filled the high, vaulted ceilings of the historic estate. The music washed over the room entirely, erasing the harsh, shrill echoes of my sister screaming. Behind me, I heard the frantic, scrambling sounds of a desperate woman realizing she was completely invisible. I heard Vanessa designer heels scrape violently against the hardwood floor as she pulled herself up from the aisle runner. I did not turn around to watch her leave. I simply listened to the heavy, frantic footsteps echoing rapidly toward the back of the hall. The massive oak doors groaned as she shoved them open. A brief, sharp gust of freezing Minnesota winter wind rushed into the building, and then the heavy doors slammed entirely shut with a loud, definitive thud. Vanessa was gone. She ran out into the freezing evening, completely alone, stripped of her fake empire and her arrogant pride. She drove back to a leased house that was about to be raided by federal authorities. She drove back to a husband who had actively used her as a human shield. Julian and I spoke our vows to each other. We did not promise a fake, flawless fairy tale. We promised absolute honesty, unyielding loyalty, and the kind of deep, genuine partnership that can survive any storm. When he kissed me, the entire room erupted into genuine, joyful applause. It was the exact opposite of the forced, polite clapping at my mother's horrible dinner party a year ago. This applause was real. The aftermath of that day played out exactly as Julian and I knew it would. I never spoke to my parents or my sister ever again. I permanently blocked their phone numbers, changed my email addresses, and instructed the security desk at my office building to instantly reject anyone bearing the last name Clark. I did not need to speak to them to know exactly how their story ended. The local news and the country club gossip network provided all the details I could ever want. Less than 48 hours after my wedding, federal agents executed a massive, coordinated raid on Derek's financial office and his sprawling 5-bedroom leased house. Derek was arrested in his driveway, wearing a cheap gray sweatshirt, holding a duffel bag full of cash. He had been trying to flee the state, exactly as I predicted. He was indicted on multiple federal counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Because he stole millions of dollars from vulnerable senior citizens, the judge denied his bail. Derek went straight into a federal holding facility. The financial destruction of my parents was swift, absolute, and incredibly public. My father, Richard, walked into the Adena Country Club exactly 3 days after my wedding. He sat down at his usual table and tried to order a $200 bottle of wine to impress his wealthy friends. When the waiter ran his premium credit card, it was violently declined. Richard threw a massive temper tantrum demanding they run it again. The club manager had to publicly inform my father that his banking institution had frozen every single account tied to his name. The Clark Family Trust was entirely vaporized. The federal government seized the $2.8 million commercial real estate portfolio to pay back the clients Derek had defrauded. My parents were completely bankrupt. The bank foreclosed on their massive, beautiful home in the suburbs. My mother, Helen, was forced to endure the ultimate humiliation. The wealthy women she had spent decades trying to impress completely turned their backs on her. The country club formally revoked their membership due to unpaid dues. My parents were forced to move into a tiny rented apartment on the opposite side of the city, drowning in legal fees and crushing debt. Vanessa lost absolutely everything. The boutique in Wayzata sued her for the rental cost of the diamond bracelets she damaged when she fell in the church aisle. The luxury SUV was repossessed from her driveway in the middle of the night. With her husband in federal prison and her parents completely broke, she had no one left to fund her glamorous lifestyle. The woman who stole my wedding dress and bragged about her perfect romance is currently working a minimum wage retail job just to pay her basic utility bills. She is entirely isolated, miserable, and entirely forgotten by the high society world she worshipped. They built their entire lives on a foundation of greed, toxic favoritism, and lies. They thought they could sacrifice my future to secure their own wealth. But the universe has a very specific way of balancing the scales. They dug a massive pit for me, and they ended up burying themselves at the very bottom of it. I did not lose a family that year. You cannot lose something you never truly possessed. What I actually did was successfully amputate a severe, toxic disease that had been poisoning my life since childhood. By cutting them out completely, I created a massive, beautiful, empty space, and Julian and I filled that space with a real life. We expanded our respective businesses. We built a beautiful home filled with warmth, laughter, and absolute trust. We surround ourselves with friends who celebrate our victories and support us during our challenges. We do not have to hide secrets. We do not have to walk on eggshells. We just get to be happy. True revenge is never about screaming or seeking a physical confrontation. True revenge is moving on and building a spectacular life that your abusers can never touch. It is the absolute, undeniable realization that you survived their worst betrayal and you emerged completely victorious. Thank you for listening to my story today. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace? Tell me about the moment you finally realized you were completely free from their control. Leave your thoughts in the comments below because I love reading about your personal victories. If you enjoyed hearing how justice was finally served, please like this video and subscribe to the Grape Vengeance channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story of karma, catching up with the people who deserve it most. Have a wonderful day, and always remember to trust your